said back then that Facebook would always be free. Is that still your objective?
Senator, yes. There will always be a version of Facebook that is free.
Well, if so, how do you sustain a business model in which users don't pay for your service?
Senator, we run ads.
I see. That's great.
Welcome back, young scholars. This is the third video on the legislative branch. The big question you should be able to answer after watching this video is Congress broken? If so, why and how do we fix it? If not, why not? So the first thing I want you to do is reflect on what percentage of Americans do you think approve of the job that Congress is doing? Jot down a guess. Now here's a quote. This is by the Terminator, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Here are some of the things that are more popular than Congress: hemorrhoids, Nickelback, traffic jams, cockroaches, root canals, colonoscopies, herpes, even herpes. They couldn't even beat herpes in the polls. And this was reviewed by a website called PolitiFact, and it was determined to actually be mostly true. There was a study that analyzed the approval rating of Congress versus these various things. This is a graph showing America's job approval rating of Congress back in 2017 when Schwarzenegger was quoted. Congress's approval rating was around 13%. As this graph notes, Congress's approval rating is actually improving. And in 2020, the approval rating is somewhere closer to about 30%. And there's an argument then that maybe Congress isn't actually broken, that Americans are starting to increasingly trust things that Congress is doing. There's still a question as to what percentage of members of Congress actually win re-election. And that's shown by this graph here. It shows incumbent re-election rates. So an incumbent is someone who is a current office holder who runs for re-election. In this graph, it shows that incumbents win re-elections about 90% of the time. So incumbents, existing office holders, win elections over challengers about 90% of the time, which shouldn't necessarily square and make sense. If people are fed up with Congress, you would think that those people would be voted out of office and replaced by somebody new, but that is not in fact the case. And you can see from this graph, most people have a pretty low opinion of most members of Congress. However, when you ask them about their own individual representative, the one who represents their district, most people have a pretty favorable opinion about their own member of Congress. So why do incumbents hold such a strong advantage over challengers? I think one reason is highlighted by this commercial.
Judge. Grassley. Here. He's always here. I'm Chuck Grassley, and I approve this message.
Incumbents have the advantage of name recognition. If you are a name like Grassley in the state of Iowa and you've been in the Senate for 40 years, people will walk into that voting booth and check the names that they recognize. They also have the advantage of having increased campaign funding because there are special interest groups and outside groups who want to maintain their connections to the people in power. And a person is an incumbent, they're more likely to win re-election. I'm going to financially support those people. So is there a solution to what potentially is a problem, maybe, of incumbents constantly winning re-election? Well, here's President Trump.
If I'm elected president, I will push for a constitutional amendment to impose term limits on all members of Congress. They've been talking about that for years. Decades of failure in Washington and decades of special interest dealing must and will come to an end.
People have been talking about term limits on Congress for years, and it's not just Republicans.
I'm about to say two words that will make Washington insiders very uncomfortable. Term limits. You and I both know we need term limits, that Congress shouldn't be a lifetime appointment. But members of Congress and the corporations who've bought our democracy hate term limits. Too bad.
This is Tom Steyer. He was running for president in 2020. He was a Democratic candidate. And he talked all the time about term limits. So this is a sort of a bipartisan solution. But there's a question as to whether it's actually a good solution. Think about it this way. There is an advantage to having experience in practically any job, especially in Congress where there are such complicated rules that you have to learn. Why would we want to throw out members of Congress after they've gotten up to speed and learned how to do their job effectively? One of the reasons why this is probably never going to happen, stop and think about it. Who would have to vote to establish term limits? Members of Congress. They'd have to do so through a constitutional amendment. So not only would you have to get members of Congress to vote against their own interests, they would also have to do so by huge majorities, right? 2/3 of both houses, 3/4 of all states in order to get a constitutional amendment. And so it's just not a very likely solution to what potentially is a problem, and maybe for some people what's not a problem. The next question we should ask is Congress the people's branch? Do its decisions reflect the will of the people? That's how the founders envisioned it and how they designed it. First of all, we've seen the number of women who are serving in Congress increasingly growing, and now it's up to about 25% of both the House and the Senate. We've seen growth in the number of racial and ethnic minorities, including blacks, Hispanics, Asians, increasing over time in Congress. There has been an increase in the number of openly LGBTQ, both nominees and members who are serving, and so we've seen increased diversity in that area as well. So I think it is fair to say that Congress is becoming increasingly diverse and reflecting the more diverse and pluralistic society that we live in. However, we can also take statistics and look at them on the flip side. So first of all, this is a graph showing the gender composition of Congress over time. And it shows that while, yes, we are seeing an increase in the number of women participating in Congress, it's still a very small percentage compared to the total amount of men who are serving in Congress. And so therefore we don't have equal gender representation in Congress. And almost all of the growth in terms of the number of women who are being elected are Democrats, where there hasn't been as much growth on the Republican side. In terms of racial composition, yes, we talked about there's increased diversity in Congress. However, we still see overwhelmingly members of Congress are white. And therefore, again, that does not reflect the ethnic diversity and racial diversity in our country. In terms of religious makeup, the vast majority of members of Congress identify as either Protestants or Catholics or some form of Christianity. You have seen growth a little bit in terms of the number of Jews, Mormons, and Orthodox Christians, but there's still what seems like some informal qualifications around religion. We've seen a decline in the number of veterans serving in Congress. So in the 1970s, it was as high as 81% of members of Congress had served in the military. Now we've seen that number dramatically drop to around only 19%. The number of foreign-born people serving in Congress has also been fairly steady, but hasn't seen much growth. Right now, we're only at about 3 to 5% of the people in Congress were actually born overseas. And finally, in terms of age, there has been a shrinking gap between the median age of Americans, that's the median age of Americans, and the average age of both the people in the Senate and the House. However, you will note that most of the people that serve in the Senate and the House are far older than the average American. So Congress, while certainly becoming more diverse, still does not reflect the demographics of the overall American public. What's the solution to this? The reality of it is this is simply the democratic process. There needs to be more members being elected who represent the broader diversity of the United States. One of the other characteristics of Congress that seems to not reflect the will of the American people is how divided and how polarized it has become.
We are frequently told that American politics are polarized. On the right, Republicans work together with other Republicans, and on the left, Democrats work with other Democrats. But Republicans and Democrats don't usually work with each other. Polarization means that politics is us and them. To understand how bad it actually is, a professor at Michigan State University looked at the networks of every U.S. senator and representative since 1973. In the 1970s and 80s, the Democrats mostly worked together, and the Republicans mostly worked together, but they still sometimes worked across the aisle to pass important legislation. Here's what it looks like now. The Democrats and Republicans almost never work together. We've been moving towards this kind of polarization in both the Senate and the House since the 1970s. But polarization can be even stronger when Republicans and Democrats actually try to undermine and attack each other. When this happens, polarization becomes us versus them. This research shows that even this stronger us versus them polarization has gotten much worse over the past 40 years. It's also shown that it doesn't matter which party is in control. American politics have grown more polarized under both Republican and Democratic-controlled Congresses.
So we see that polarization played out in Congress, and you can see it here in the data where we saw in the 1970s more members of Congress willing to work across the aisle in a bipartisan way to try and get legislation passed. Now we are seeing fewer and fewer more moderate members, and instead we're seeing members who refuse to work with the other party and who instead only support bills that are either democratically supported bills or Republican supported bills. Now the effect of this is that we're seeing fewer laws passed in each Congress. We can see that reflected in this chart. So this shows the number of laws made by each Congress, and you can see the sort of steady decline that has taken place over the last 50 years. So one question becomes, why are our politics becoming more polarized?
There are a couple of things that, in my mind at least, contribute to our politics being more polarized than people actually are. The balkanization of the media means that we just don't have a common place where we get common facts and a common worldview the way we did 20, 30 years ago, and that just keeps on accelerating. Technology, which brings the world to us, also allows us to narrow our point of view. That's contributed.
So one argument is that the media contributes to this. Oftentimes we only are receiving the opinions and analysis that supports our own worldview, whether it's through our social media accounts or through the 24-hour news stations that we watch. So there is evidence that the American public is becoming more polarized, and Congress is just simply reflecting that fact. So Congress reflects the growing partisanship and polarization of the general public. Does this mean that we are doomed to perpetual gridlock?
Now, there have been periods in the past where we've been pretty polarized. I think there just wasn't polling around. Even during the so-called golden age where you had liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, and there was deal cutting going on in Congress. Generally speaking, big stuff didn't get done unless there was a major crisis and or you had big majorities of one party controlling the Congress and a president of the same party.
Some people look at the situation in Congress with all of the gridlock and say that's exactly how our government is supposed to function. It was designed to function that way. And as President Obama mentions, there have been times of significant partisanship in the past. We can see here in the mid-1800s. Now, to be fair, this was when a civil war broke out. And I'm not really suggesting that's the direction that we're moving, but it's not like this type of partisanship is unprecedented in American history. Let's think about this. So when the coronavirus outbreak occurred in 2020, Congress actually got to work passing legislation to try and help the American people, to help small business owners, to help hospitals that were overwhelmed. Both the House and the Senate, the House which was controlled by Democrats, the Senate which was controlled by Republicans, actually stepped up and started passing legislation. And I think that's what oftentimes happens. As President Obama said, sometimes it takes a crisis for us to sort of come together as a country. Congress does still seem to function in times of crisis when we desperately need some type of law or policy change. And so, as dire as sometimes it seems like, they're never going to get together and help each other, when a crisis does break out, I think we can have confidence that the legislative branch still does work. And so as a result of watching this video, you should be starting to come up with an answer to this big question. Is Congress broken? If so, why and how do we fix it? If not, why not? There will be another video in which we get into some more potential causes. And as always, thanks for watching.